Take a deep breath and allow yourself to settle in. Let the day's concerns drift softly into the background as we begin a journey through time, a quiet, measured stroll along the corridors of memory and earth. This is not the tale of generals or gallant charges, not a recounting of medals or decisive victories. Instead, tonight we will trace the worn boots and heavy breath of the common manthos who lived and endured among the mud and wire of the Western Front. The First World War. A conflict so vast it reshaped continents and minds alike. But beneath the grand arc of empires and armistices were the trenches, and within them, men, soldiers, most young, many frightened, all changed. This episode gently explores the daily life of a trench soldier in the Great War, what he saw, how he moved, what he endured, and how, amidst the bleak and bitter landscape, a strange rhythm of life persisted. Let's begin with a quiet immersion and imagined morning in the trenches, drawn not from the heroic pages of history books, but from letters home, diaries smudged with rain, and recollections murmured years after the guns fell silent. Imagine, if you will, that it is very early morning. The sky is a dull grain, neither day nor night, and the air is heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and old smoke. You are standing in a trench, not a clean, symmetrical line of sandbags, but a long, narrow ditch, carved into the soil with spades, and the urgency of survival. The walls are lined with wooden planks and corrugated iron where supplies allowed. In places, the wood has buckled, half sunken into the oozing mud that never truly dries. You wake not in a bed, but in a Duguta-cramped earthen recess built into the side of the trench wall. It smells faintly of mould and something metallic, perhaps the lingering trace of wet rations or rusted gear. Your uniform is heavy, damp, as always. The wool holds the moisture from the night air, and your boots, caked in a crust of muck, squelch with every movement. A soft command more routine than urgent drifts down the line. Stand to. This is the morning ritual, performed in the grey half-light before the sun rises. It is the hour when enemy attacks are most likely, and so every man stands to attention at the fire step, rifle in hand, scanning across no man's land, though few ever see more than the swirling mist and shattered silhouettes of trees. There is no breakfast to look forward to in the traditional sense. The cookhouse is far behind the lines. Instead, a tin of cold bully beef, perhaps some dog-eared biscuit charred as stone and weak tea, brewed with water boiled over a small brazier, often shared among a few. The tea has a faint metallic taste, drawn from the old petrol can in which it was made. Rats, fat from feeding on discarded scraps and, at times, darker things, scurry between the duckboards at your feet. They are fearless now, and they seem to move with almost comical confidence, knowing full well that the men around them lack the energy to chase them off. The sounds of the trench are both constant and subdued. Somewhere down the line, a soldier mutters a joke under his breath. Another sharpens his bayonet, the soft rasp of metal on metal briefly punctuating the ambient noise. In the background, the ever-present chorus of dripping water, distant artillery thuds, and the occasional cough or low groan. Letters from home are treasures, folded and reread until the paper softens like old linen. They are tucked into breast pockets, wrapped in oilskin if possible. In a small moment of quiet, a man might pull out a photo of his family, or a postcard from his village, a fragile reminder of a life untouched by this damp, grey world. Sanitation is rudimentary. Latrines known by the grimly ironic name, the cesspits are dug at a slight distance, but odours drift freely. Hygiene is minimal. The lice, affectionately called chats, are ever present, burrowing into seams and biting at the scalp. Most men learn to live with them, scratching almost absent-mindedly, just as one might adjust a collar or tug at a sleeve. Shaving is rare, bathing rarer still. A bucket of cold water might be passed down the line on a better day, but mostly, one accepts the grime. Over time, you begin to distinguish the scents of various stages of damp uniform, of boots long unpolished, of mud mixed with cordite and smoke. And yet, amidst it all, there are gestures of normalcy. A game of cards, played on an ammunition box, a harmonica tune, slightly off-key, threading its way through the trench walls. Cigarettes are currency and comfort, passed between friends, and sometimes bartered with the occasional French local, or even enemy prisoner. As the sun lifts, pale and reluctant behind the clouds, duties begin. A working party may be ordered to repair sections of the trench damaged in the night. Others will carry supplies up from the rear. Sentries rotate. Messengers run with folded notes tucked in oilskin, delivering orders between positions. Every step outside the trench brings danger snipers, stray shells, but necessity leaves no room for hesitation. And so the day unfolds, slow and steady. No clocks are needed. Time is marked instead by routinistan, rations, sentry duty, sleep in 4-hour shifts when possible. There is monotony in it, yes, but also a strange rhythm, and within that rhythm, a fragile sense of stability. Now, having settled into this world, let us gently shift our focus beyond the trench wallstow, the personal journey of one soldier, and how his life before, during, and perhaps even after, would be shaped by the slow churn of war. Let us now turn our gaze toward one man, not a general, not a figure etched into textbooks, but rather an ordinary soldier, a man whose experiences echoed those of countless others. His name was Thomas Elwood. He was not a soldier by calling. In fact, before the war, Thomas had been a railway clerk in Yorkshire, a quiet man. His days were marked by timetables, coal-smudged paperwork, and a predictable routine that suited his temperament. Like many, he enlisted in the heady rush of patriotic fervour in 1914. The posters promised adventure, the newspapers predicted a short war, and so he joined the King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry, carrying little more than a pack, a pair of sturdy boots, and the hope that he might be home by Christmas. He was 22. Basic training was brisk and largely improvised. The military had not anticipated such a flood of volunteers, and many found themselves drilling with wooden rifles or marching in civilian clothes. But the enthusiasm was real, and Thomas, ever patient and methodical, adapted quickly. When he first reached the front in the spring of 1915, the reality bore little resemblance to the songs sung in the recruiting halls. The trenches were already a complex network of saps and support lines, front lines, and communication trenches. The war had settled into a grim stalemate. Movement was rare. Danger, however, was not. Thomas's first days were marked by observation. He watched the older hands, the ones who had survived the winter wrapping oilskins around their legs, keeping dry socks in their breast pockets to preserve a measure of warmth. He noticed how they moved silently, how they avoided standing silhouettes against the trench line, how they crouched just a little when passing through narrow sap trenches, as though the walls themselves held memory. His letters home were sparse and careful. "All is well," he often wrote. "The lads are in good spirits." Beneath the paper-thin optimism, the truth was more complex. He witnessed his first bombardment only a week after arrival. The ground shook violently, and for hours afterward, his ears rang, the sound of impact etched into his very bones. He did not speak of it. In time, Thomas found himself taking part in a raider, small, nighttime operation to gather intelligence from the opposing trench. It was his first close contact with the enemy. The crossing of no man's land was a slow, nerve-wracking crawl. Wire cutters in hand, the men moved beneath the low-hanging mist. Flashes of signal flares overhead briefly illuminated the landscape in ghostly white. The raid achieved its limited objective, but not without loss. One of Thomas's closest mates, a tall, red-cheeked man from Kent named Walker, did not return. There was no time to mourn in the moment. The return to their own line was silent. That night, Thomas lay awake, not because of noise, but because of its absence. The human mind, he found, often fills silence with its own echoes. In the months that followed, he rose slowly through the ranks, not because he sought command, but because others fell, and he endured. By late 1916, during the bitter stretch of the Somme campaign, Thomas had become a lance corporal. He kept his head down, his boots dry when possible, and ensured his men had tea, socks, and a measure of order in the chaos. The Somme changed him. It changed many. During that endless summer of mud and blood, the lines moved only slightly, but lives were altered forever. Thomas watched as men went over the top, many never to return. He developed a habit of keeping a small notebook in which he wrote, not just names of the fallen, but snippets of remembered conversations, shared jokes, or half-finished stories. A quiet ritual of remembrance. His health suffered during the winter of 1917. A bout of trench foot forced him to be sent back to a casualty clearing station for several weeks. There, He encountered the war from a different angle, the bandaged silence of the injured, the quiet industry of the nurses, the soft murmurs of those recovering gore not. He returned to the line in the spring, weaker but no less resolute. When the war finally ended, in November of 1918, Thomas found himself oddly adrift. There was no great moment of celebration. Instead, there was relief. The guns ceased, and a peculiar stillness settled across the land. For a long while, he simply sat in the trench, staring out at the wire, unsure what to feel. He returned home to a country that had changed, though perhaps not as much as he had. He married a girl named Elsie, a school teacher he'd exchanged letters with during the war. They settled in a small cottage near Leeds. He worked for the railway again, quietly, steadily. Thomas rarely spoke of the trenches. Only later in life, when asked by his grandchildren, did he recall a few gentle anecdotes of sharing a tin of jam on Christmas morning, of playing cards under the stars, of watching the sun rise over a land he would never quite forget. He died in 1962, a survivor of one of the most grueling experiences a human can endure, having lived a life not of grandeur, but of enduring grace. And with Thomas's story as our guide, we will now drift into another realm of the warone of quiet puzzles, remnants buried in time, and the clues left behind by those who once walked the duckboards and dared to hope. As we continue our quiet descent into the fabric of trench life, we find ourselves gently peeling back the layers of time down into the soil itself. For history, especially that of the First World War, is not only remembered in books or retold through fading letters, it rests quietly in the ground, waiting to be unearthed sometimes by intention, and often by chance. Across the former Western Front stretching from the fields of Flanders to the forests of the Somme farmers, still turn up rusted bayonets, dented helmets, and fragments of old canteens as they till their land. The French have a name for it, la récolte du Firth iron harvest. Each spring, the soil surrenders another quiet offering, a silent testimony to what once took place in these now tranquil landscapes. One particularly poignant discovery occurred near the village of Karspach in Alsace. During a routine construction project in 2011, workers stumbled upon a sealed German tunnel, long forgotten beneath the surface. Inside, archaeologists found the remains of 21 soldiers, entombed by a shell collapse nearly a century earlier. The air had preserved their belongings, their boots, personal effects, even writing still visible on their kits. What made the find so haunting was its stillness. The men appeared almost frozen in time, sitting or lying as though merely asleep. There was no horror in their appearance, just a solemn sense of interruption. It was as though the world above had continued without them, while below, their moment remained undisturbed. Elsewhere, in Belgium's Zonnebeke region, archaeologists exploring beneath a modern-day field uncovered an entire stretch of trench, complete with duckboards, firing steps, and dugouts. Inside one section, they found an unopened ration tin, still sealed after all these years, its contents long spoiled served, as a ghostly reminder of a meal never eaten. Beyond the objects themselves, these discoveries offer something intangible but profound, a sense of scale. It is easy to imagine the trenches as a network of corridors, but seeing a preserved communication trench winding across a meadow, one begins to feel the scope, the depth, the isolation, and the immense human effort required to dig and maintain these lines with only picks, shovels, and weary hands. Not all findings are dramatic. A single brass button, a rusted spoon, a set of dog tags, their inscription faint but legible, yet each carries weight. They are not mere artifacts, they are whispers from the past, small affirmations that someone once stood here, someone waited, feared, hoped. Some discoveries are less tangible still, drawn not from the earth but from letters and journals found in attics or locked trunks. In one such account, a soldier writes of carving his initials into a wooden beam inside a dugout near Arras. Decades later, a local historian, combing through the remains of a half-collapsed shelter, found just such initials dated, weathered, but there. There is an intimacy to these remnants. Unlike grand ruins or battlefields of antiquity, these relics are deeply personal. They are not monuments to conquest or kingship, but small, utilitarian, everyday things. Shaving mirrors, tobacco tins, playing cards softened by use. They belong to no one famous. And yet, In that very anonymity, they become all the more human. The field of First World War archaeology is careful, reverent. Unlike deeper historical digs, these sites are often close enough in time that relatives still live, names still hold meaning. When remains are discovered, efforts are made quietly, diligently to identify, to honor. Some are reinterred with full military rites. Others remain unknown, buried once more beneath simple white stones inscribed with the words, "Known unto God." These artifacts, both grand and humble, serve not just as clues to the past, but as reminders of its proximity. The war may seem distant, obscured by sepia tones and old film reels, but in truth, it lies just beneath the surface, sometimes literally. And with each unearthed item, the trenches speak once more, not in trumpet blasts or gunfire, but in the quiet rustle of uncovered cloth, the faint glint of tarnished metal, the sigh of a story long paused, now softly resumed. As we move forward, let us now leave behind the archaeological and consider instead the social fabric of this strange world. What was the difference between the man in the dugout and the officer in the command post? What quiet tensions stirred beneath the mud and within the mess halls? Let us explore the layered structure of trench society, the unseen hierarchies and subtle divisions that shaped every moment of a soldier's day. As we step deeper into the shadowed world of trench life, let us now peer through the lens of social structure. For even here, amidst the shared discomfort and danger, society did not dissolve. It reshaped itself, often subtly, sometimes starkly within the contours of military rank, upbringing, and pre-war identity. Though the trenches were physical equalizers, mud, hunger, cold affecting nearly all the invisible lines of class and command, were never fully erased. The rank-and-file soldier, like Thomas Elwood, often hailed from the working classes: miners, railway clerks, farmhands, shop assistantsmen who had rarely travelled more than a few miles from their birthplace before donning the khaki uniform. These were the men in the front-line dugouts, the ones fetching water cans under cover of night, mending sandbags, and sleeping in the rain. Their labour was constant, their courage unheralded. Above them were the junior officers, lieutenants, and captains, many of whom came from Britain's upper and upper middle classes. In the early years of the war, commissions were often reserved for those with the right background: university education, good breeding, the polish of command. Public schools like Eton and Harrow were well represented in officers' messes, and many young lieutenants went to war with barely a few weeks of training, chosen less for experience than for accent. These young officers often shared the dangers of the front, leading their men over the top, and sleeping in the same trenches, but their world retained quiet privileges. Officers' dugouts were slightly more spaciousome, even equipped with camp beds, gramophones, and bottles of wine sent from home. A servant, known as a batman, often attended to their uniform, fetched meals, or prepared tea, even in the mud. The contrast was particularly evident in how meals were taken. While the average soldier ate hastily from a mess tin, often cold, often identical day to day, the officer might dine off a folding table with proper crockery, when supplies allowed. The food was usually the same in substance: bully beef, biscuits, tinned vegetables, but presentation and ritual drew a line, however subtle. Communication, too, reflected the hierarchy. Orders flowed downward, but complaints rarely moved upward. A private might be reprimanded for a muddy boot or a late salute, while a poorly planned assault costing dozens of lives might pass without public reproach, at least in the moment. But to say the officers were aloof would be to paint with too broad a brush. Many young lieutenants developed profound bonds with their men, shared danger, shared loss, blurred the edges of social difference. Letters and diaries from both privates and officers often speak of quiet respect, earned in the small, steady acts of daily endurance. Still, mistrust lingered. The term brass hats was used with biting irony to refer to high-ranking officers far from the front. These generals, often in safe headquarters miles behind the lines, were seen fairly or noted as distant, detached, sending men into impossible assaults from the comfort of a leather chair and a brandy decanter. The gap between the trenches and the command tent could be vast, both in miles and in understanding. Soldiers joked grimly that HQ stood not for headquarters, but happily quarters, far from the rats and rot. This tension sometimes spilled into song or satire. Soldiers composed bitterly humorous trench songs, mocking the leadership or the absurdity of orders. One popular refrain went, "We're here, because we're here, because we're here, because we're here." A circular logique, an echo of futility, sung softly in the dark. Yet even in this rigid structure, fluidity existed. Battlefield commissions earned through bravery or necessity allowed some men to rise from the ranks. These men, dubbed temporary gentlemen, straddled a strange space, respected by the soldiers they once served beside, often eyed warily by those born into command. And beyond the British lines, structures varied. French and German trenches held their own hierarchies, their own codes. Some armies were more formal, others more pragmatic, but the undercurrent of status, of authority versus obedience, was a common theme. Back in Britain, the class divide softened slightly during the war years. Shared sacrifice led to shifting perceptions. A post-war world would slowly begin to reimagine the old order. But in the trenches, even amid the rain and ruin, one's voice, one's manner of speech, one's place in the dugout still mattered. Now, let us step away from these human divisions and cast our gaze across the trenches themselves. Not just their shape and sound, but the strange ecology they became, the creatures that shared this space, the smells that defined it, the rhythms of nature interrupted by man. For even here, amidst the destruction, life in unexpected forms persisted. Amid the mechanical clatter of rifles, the distant rumble of artillery, and the human chorus of boots and voices, another presence made itself known in the trenchescent, persistent, and often overlooked. Nature. Not the serene nature of pastoral paintings, but a wild, altered version strained through the prism of war. Imagine again the trench, not just a scar upon the landscape, but a habitatone carved from the land, and then reshaped by water, weather, and time. The trench was never still. It shifted, collapsed, filled with water, froze solid, then thawed into sludge. It was as if the land resisted its role, forever trying to reclaim what had been stolen by spade and shell. Mud was the dominant feature, not just a mess to be cleaned or stepped over, but a living, creeping element of the soldier's world. It sucked at boots and swallowed tools. It climbed up trousers and seeped into greatcoats. There were days when men were half buried by it, their bodies anchored in place, as though the earth itself had reached up to hold them still. During the rainy seasons, particularly in Flanders, the trenches became little more than elongated ditches of water and muck. Pumps and buckets worked endlessly, but the water returned, always. In some places, the water table sat just beneath the surface, so every hole dug immediately began to fill. It was a constant, quiet battle knot of bullets, but of buckets. But mud was not the only inhabitant. There were creatures, mice, rats, frogs, lice, fleece, each adapting in their own way to this man-made wilderness. The rats were infamous. They bred quickly, feeding on discarded food, spoiled rations, and sometimes more grim provisions. Soldiers swore the rats were as large as cats. Whether or not that's entirely true, their presence was unquestionable. At night, they scurried along trench walls, nibbled on unattended kits, and sometimes brushed across a soldier's chest as he tried to sleep. And yet, men grew used to them. A flick of the wrist, a muttered curse, and the rodent would vanish into shadow. Some soldiers even made peace with them, feeding them crumbs out of boredom or odd companionship. In a world so uncertain, even the predictable appearance of a rat could be oddly grounding. Lice, or chats, were less tolerable. They nested in seams, under collars, and especially in the folds of woolen underclothes. The itching was constant. Men scratched themselves bloody in their sleep, though rarely woke from it. Delousing stations existed, but were far from perfect. Uniforms might be singed over a flame to kill the lice, only for the eggs to remain, hatching days later. And then there were the sounds of nature muted by the background of war but not erased. Birds still sang in the early hours, their songs clear and high above the trench line. The larks were noted often in diaries. "Strange," wrote one soldier, "to hear such a sweet song above such a dreadful place." Foxes and wild dogs wandered through the shell-pocked fields at night, silent witnesses to human struggle. Some soldiers kept dogs as trench mascots, feeding them scraps and speaking to them in the long hours between shellings. Cats, too, found homes among the dugouts, helping to control the rodent population and, in their quiet independence, providing a fleeting sense of normalcy. Even flora found its way back. Despite shell craters and poison gas, weeds grew. Grasses emerged between the duckboards in spring. Wildflowers bloomed in no man's land, where no man dared to pick them. Red poppies later, to become a symbol of remembrance, grew freely in the churned fields of the Somme and Ypres, often the only colour in a world otherwise painted in browns and greys. At night, when the guns rested and the sky cleared, the moon hung low and luminous, casting a pale light over the shattered trees and wire. Soldiers described moments of eerie quiet, broken only by the distant bark of a dog or the far-off whistle of a train many miles behind the lines. It was in these moments so still, so at odds with the chaos of the day, that the landscape seemed to breathe again. The trench was a paradox. It was a place of death, but also of unexpected life. The men who lived within it came to understand the rhythms of their strange environment, not in control of it, but surviving alongside it. Nature, in its own way, endured. And now, with the night birds settled and the trench quiet again, let us explore the rhythm of the day. What shaped the hours? What rituals defined the passage of time when clocks were rare and urgency eternal? In our next segment, we will trace a soldier's routine in moments of drama, but in the soft repetitions that lent a kind of fragile order to the madness. In the trenches, where moments of terror could erupt without warning, it was the gentle pull of routine that gave many soldiers their footing. It may seem strange, perhaps even contradictory, that life in such a chaotic place could follow a pattern, and yet it did, for it had to. Each day unfolded, not according to clocks, but to custom and necessity. There were no hours chiselled into stone, only rhythms passed along by those who had already endured them. The day began, always, with stand to. This was the earliest rite, conducted at first light when visibility crept slowly into the gloom. Men were roused from their dugouts and lined up along the fire step, rifles in hand, eyes scanning the enemy lines. It was a time of silence, watchfulness. For dawn was often when raids came, and so every man stood, weary and waiting. When no attack came, and it rarely did, the men were allowed to stand down. Some brewed tea, kindled from powdered fuel and tepid water. Others lit cigarettes, their smoke curling upward in lazy spirals toward a sky painted with drizzle. The flavour of the tea was often metallic, the texture of the biscuits chalky, but it was warm, and it was something. Breakfast, if it could be called that, followed. Tins of makanoki stew, a dense mixture of turnips, potatoes, and meat, might be passed around, heated over improvised stoves fashioned from empty food tins and paraffin wax. More often, meals were cold. Hard biscuits softened with tea, or jam spread on a slice of stale bread if lucky. The rest of the morning was devoted to maintenance. A soldier's day in the trench was not one of waiting alone, it was filled with labour. Sandbags were replaced, duckboards repaired, parapets reinforced with earth and timber, trenches dug deeper, widened, or extended. Fatigue partiesmal working groups were dispatched to retrieve supplies or carry up ammunition from the rear. These were perilous duties. Even a journey of a few hundred yards could mean exposure to snipers or the blast of a stray shell. The roads and paths behind the lines, known as communication trenches, were themselves narrow, muddy labyrinths. Midday brought no relief, no formal meal break. Rations were eaten when time allowed, often while seated on the edge of a dugout, boots dangling over the mud. Occasionally, a field kitchen would deliver warm food, but the logistics of moving through the mire meant such luxuries were rare. In the afternoon, letters might be written. These were moments of calm, where thoughts wandered beyond the trench. Soldiers wrote about the weather, the food, the names of friends. They avoided darker details, sparing their families the worry. Some sketched the shape of the trench. Others wrote poetry-fragile verses scratched into battered notebooks, filled with longing and sometimes a dry, sardonic wit. As evening fell, the routine reversed. Stand to again at dusk. Rifles cleaned, periscopes checked. The transition from light to dark was watched closely, as night patrols became more frequent after the sun dipped below the wire. After dark, the trench transformed. Patrols slipped silently into no man's land, listening for movement, cutting wire, mapping enemy positions. These were the most dangerous assignments, where the terrain swallowed sound and shadow hid threat. For those left behind, there was little sleep. Dugouts were cramped, some shared by 5 or 6 men. Sleep came in short shifts, 2 or 4 hours at most, interrupted by sentry duty or the thunder of a midnight barrage. The duties of a sentry were sombre and vital. Positioned at regular intervals along the trench wall, the sentry was expected to keep constant watch, eyes strained to pierce the dark, ears attuned to the smallest rustle. A man might doze in spite of himself, and be jolted awake by the soft warning of a comrade or the harsher reprimand of an officer. In these small rituals, brew-ups, roll calls, repair duties, there was a fragile sense of continuity, a rhythm carved into the days like grooves into soft wood. It gave the men a framework, a sense of control over an environment that otherwise defied logic and comfort. There were moments of levity too, a game of cards, a song hummed softly beneath one's breath, a trench newspaper passed hand to hand, filled with biting satire and news from the rear. The Wipers Times, published by British soldiers in Ypres, was one such paper, its pages filled with mock advertisements and dry, sardonic wit. Humour, after all, was not only a relief, it was resistance. As midnight approached, the trench quieted once more. The fire step was manned, the brazier glowed faintly, and the rats resumed their scurrying. The earth was always wet, the air always heavy, but within the ritual of repetition, the mind could rest. Next, we shall shift focus once more, this time, to the tools of the trade, the uniform, the rifle, the gear, both cumbersome and comforting. Each item carried weight, physically and metaphorically. Let us now explore the things trench soldiers wore and carried, how they helped, how they hindered, and what they meant to the men who bore them. The life of a trench soldier was defined not only by mud and routine, but also by the weight of what he wore, carried, and relied upon. His gear was both a shield and a shackle essential to his survival, yet often an added hardship in already difficult conditions. Let us begin with the uniform. The standard British soldier's uniform during much of the war consisted of heavy wool serge. It was designed more for parade ground appearance than field functionality. The Colora muted khaki was chosen to blend into the earth, offering a degree of camouflage in the open landscape of the Western Front. But its material, though durable, was not well suited to the trenches. It retained water, sagged under rain, and took hours, sometimes days, to dry. In winter, it froze stiff. In summer, it grew stifling. The tunic was buttoned high at the neck, often layered over a coarse undershirt. Trousers were tucked into puttees-long woolen wraps, wound tightly around the lower legs to prevent mud and debris from getting into boots. These wraps, while effective, were time-consuming to apply and could become soaked and uncomfortable after even a short march. The boots, known as ammunition boots, were sturdy and studded with hobnails. They were built to last, but not to breathe. Once filled with trench water, they stayed soaked. Wet socks led to trench foot, a condition that could turn from numb discomfort into infection in a matter of days. Dry socks, as a result, became as valuable as food. The helmet, introduced mid-war, was a steel bowl known affectionately and sometimes mockingly as the Brodie helmet. Its flat, wide brim was ideal for deflecting shrapnel falling from above, but offered little protection from the side. Still, it was better than nothing. Many soldiers regarded their helmet as a talisman, worn at all times, even while asleep. Over his uniform, a soldier carried webbing, a system of canvas straps and pouches that wrapped around the torso and waist. Into these, he packed a variety of necessities: ammunition, entrenching tools, water bottle, mess tin, first aid packet, and sometimes a gas mask item that became mandatory after chemical weapons entered the war. The gas mask itself underwent several iterations. Early versions were little more than flannel pads soaked in chemicals and tied over the nose and mouth. Later models, like the small box respirator, provided more effective protection. Soldiers kept them close at hand, always alert for the dreaded gas alarm, a metal triangle struck with an iron bar. Then came the rifle. The Lee Enfield, standard issue for British troops, was a reliable bolt-action weapon with a 10-round magazine. It could be fired rapidly by a trained soldiersome capable of squeezing off 15 aimed rounds per minute. It was not just a tool for combat, but a companion of sorts, cleaned daily, handled with care, and sometimes even named. In addition to the rifle, A bayonet was issued long, slender, and deadly in close quarters. Many soldiers, however, found it more useful as a cooking skewer or trench tool. Fighting was often done at range, and melee combat, while feared, was relatively rare. Grenades, colloquially called Mills bombs, appeared more frequently later in the war. Bulky, but effective, they became a key tool in raids and defences. Flare guns were used to signal between lines, casting eerie green or red glows over no man's land at night, their arcs both beautiful and ominous. A trench soldier's pack, when fully loaded, could weigh over 60 pounds. It contained a ground sheet, spare clothing, mess kit, rations, and other essentials. When moving into position, this load became a test of endurance. Marches were slow, and every added pound meant more fatigue, especially through knee-deep mud or shell-torn roads. Amidst these practical tools were also the personal items: a photograph tucked into a helmet liner, a Bible or small prayer book, its corners worn soft, a folded letter, a rabbit's foot, a silver coin from home. These were things of comfort, superstition, or simply memory, each one unique, each one quietly cherished. When not in battle, soldiers often modified their kits for comfort. Some stitched extra pockets into their tunics, others scavenged enemy equipment. German boots were prized for their quality. Scarves, knitted by women's groups back home, offered rare warmth. Occasionally, even bits of civilian attire made their way into the Trenchesser flat cap here, a warm jacket there blurring the lines between soldier and man. And so the uniform and equipment became not only a necessity, but an extension of the soldier himself. Every item bore the marks of his journey, the mud of 100 days, the wear of countless watches, the imprint of his body moulded into the fabric. As we now draw near the close of our exploration, let us consider the memory of it all. How was this war remembered? How did those who endured its trenches carry those years into the quiet aftermath of peace? Our next segment reflects on memory on commemoration, silence, and the long, soft echo of war in the decades that followed. When the guns finally fell silent on the 11th of November, 1918, the world did not cheer in unison. In many corners of the Western Front, the hush was strange, almost disorienting. For the soldiers, the end came not with fanfare, but with the slow realization that something vast and all-consuming had passed. But what remained? The trenches were soon abandoned, left to rot, collapse, and return to the earth. In the months and years that followed, many were filled in, reclaimed by farmers, or turned into quiet groves and fields. But the memory of them lingered etched not into stone, but into hearts, letters, and the quiet spaces between words. For the men who returned, like Thomas Elwood, the transition was not seamless. The mud still clung in memory. The noise, or the absence of it, echoed in dreams. And in towns across Britain, France, Belgium, and beyond, entire communities learned to live with the absence of those who did not return. In the early 1920s, monuments began to rise, not of triumph, but of mourning. Cenotaphs in stone, inscribed with names and dates, were erected in nearly every village and city. The names were listed alphabetically. No rank, no class, just loss. Perhaps the most iconic symbol of this remembrance is the tomb of the unknown warrior. In Britain, France, and several other nations, the remains of an unidentified soldier were interred with full honours. Their anonymity gave them universality. They stood, not for one, but for all. Poppies, once just wildflowers of the Western Front, became symbols. Their scarlet petals echoed the blood and beauty of those fields. The poem In Flanders Fields, penned by Canadian physician John McCrae, captured the sombre tone of post-war reflection. Its verses were whispered in classrooms, carved into plaques, worn in silence on lapels. Each year, on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, silence is observed, not a celebratory pause, but a reverent one, the kind of silence that swells with meaning. Across train stations, shops, schools, and homes, people stand still. 2 minutes, not long, but long enough to remember. Some who survived the war chose to never speak of it. Their medals were left in drawers, their stories untold. It was too near, too jagged. Others, later in life, gave interviews, wrote memoirs, or spoke to family. The recollections were rarely dramatic, More often, they were about the mundane, the cold, the food, the silence after shelling, the way a friend smiled on the morning of an attack. In literature, the Great War cast a long shadow. Writers like Siegfried Sassoon, Wilfred Owen, and Vera Brittain captured the emotional weight of the trenches. Their words were not celebratory. They were raw, restrained, and deeply human. They wrote of fear, of duty, of the small things: mud on boots, a hand on a shoulder, the hollowing quiet after loss. Museums, too, became sanctuaries of memory. In glass cases lay rusted helmets, torn letters, faded photographs. Visitors wandered slowly, hushed not by instruction but by instinct. The objects inside mundane, to some were sacred to others, not because of their rarity, but because of their familiarity. These were the things their fathers, grandfathers, great-uncles had touched. And across the former battlefields, nature healed. Grass grew, trees returned. In some places, shell craters filled with rain became ponds, habitats for frogs and reeds. But signs remained, trenches preserved as memorials, cemeteries tended with quiet devotion. In Tyne-Cot, in Belgium, the largest Commonwealth War cemetery, nearly 12,000 white headstones stretch in neat rows. Many bear no name, simply a soldier of the Great War, known unto God. Time has moved on. The last trench veterans passed into memory, their stories held now by books, recordings, and their descendants. But in many ways their presence lingers, in the rhythm of remembrance ceremonies, in the poppy pinned to a coat, in the quiet, reflective walk taken past a stone memorial on a grey November morning. The memory of trench life is not one of grandeur, but of endurance, of small acts of care in a world of chaos, of quiet courage in the face of overwhelming odds, and of a generation who bore the weight of the world on their shoulders, one muddy step at a time. And now, dear listener, let us bring our journey to a gentle close. And now, with the flicker of lanterns fading and the night deepening around us, we step gently back from the edges of the trench, from the cold timber walls and damp earthen floors, and return slowly to the world of the present. The life of a trench soldier in the First World War was not one of spectacle or sweeping drama, but of quiet, constant endurance. It was a life shaped by routine and ritual, discomfort and camaraderie, hardship and fleeting comforts. Day after day, in the churned landscapes of France and Belgium, ordinary men bore extraordinary burden, scurried not in glory, but in silence. You have now walked beside them, if only softly. You've felt the weight of their gear, heard the lark's song above the wire, traced the rhythm of their days, and glimpsed the small human acts that held their world together. Let the memory of this place settle gently in your thoughts, not to disturb your rest, but to offer contrast. For now, as you lie in warmth, perhaps beneath the gentle rustle of blankets or the hum of a quiet room, let the stillness embrace you. No mud beneath your boots, no cold steel helmet pressing down, just the soft certainty of now. The trenches, for all their hardship, are still with us, not in fear, but in memory, in stone memorials weathered by time, in names read aloud on autumn mornings, in the silent pages of journals left unread on old shelves. Tonight, you've heard their story told not in drumbeats or parades, but in the quiet voice of remembrance, a slow, steady march through history's most hushed battlefield. And now, as your breath deepens and your eyes grow heavy, know that you carry with you a piece of that quiet world held gently in thought, like a photograph in a breast pocket. Let sleep come easily. Let the past rest peacefully, and may your dreams be quiet, steady, and kind. Good night.